Today is my 30th birthday. And if you'll indulge me, I'm going to ask you to imagine that it's the decade I was born in the 1980s. Now, I should say that the stories I'm going to share with you are based on real events, but some of the characters are made up. So with that in mind, let's begin. This is Sarah. Sarah is a community organiser who was involved in the campaign to legalise homosexuality in New Zealand in the 1980s. Sarah is gay, and while it's never been illegal for her to sleep with other women, for men sleeping with men, it was considered a crime that could put you in prison. In fact, when Sarah was born, it was still legal in New Zealand for gay men to be flogged, whipped, or sentenced to hard labour simply for being gay. Sarah couldn't stomach that, and so in 1980, when she was 21 years old, she joined the movement for gay rights. She had just joined the Wellington Lesbian Centre, which was a support group for women in relationships with women. When she first joined, the group wanted to buy an ad on a Wellington bus shelter that was basically advertising their support group, trying to grow their community to show each other moral support. But the Wellington City Council banned the ad because a small boy might see it and ask his mother what a lesbian is. True story, by the way. That was the beginning for Sarah of what would be a long fought for and hard won campaign for equality. Sarah was part of the gay rights movement, and for 5 whole years, her and hundreds of others would go around to strangers' houses, knock on doors, and ask them to sign the petition to legalise homosexuality in New Zealand. She would meet with her MP to ask what they could do to decriminalise homosexuality in New Zealand. She would help organise rallies and paint banners with colourful messages of love and equality and fairness on the front. She would organise community town hall meetings, often the person at the back, baking cakes or making people cups of tea so that their bellies were full and their spirits were high. And to give you an idea of the political climate of what Sarah and her friends were up against at that time, I'm going to play you an audio clip from Norman Jones, who was an MP.
You're back into the sewers. You're back into the sewers where you come from. Turn around and look at them. Look at them. Gaze upon them. You're looking into Hades. You're looking at the homosexuals. Don't look too long. You might catch AIDS. All right. Thank you very much.
In case you couldn't quite hear what was said there, go back into the sewers where you came from. Turn around and look at them. You're looking into Hades. Don't look too long. You might catch AIDS. That is what a New Zealand politician said to a community hall full of hundreds of people in 1985, just 3 years before I was born. But thankfully, despite that, Sarah and people like Sarah persisted, and in 1986, the Homosexual Law Reform Act was passed. It was no longer criminal to be gay. This is David. David is a pilot. And in 1984, he found out he was also an activist. Now, David's story revolves around this woman here, who's Naida. She's real. This is a current photo of her. Naida is a Maori woman who worked as a toll operator at the post office. Every day she would go into work, she would sit down, and she would pick up the phone and she would say to the callers, "Kia ora," which means be healthy or be well. One day, her supervisor overheard this and threatened to fire her for using a non-standard greeting. Now, at the time, Naida was renting a post office house, which meant that if she lost her job, she would also lose her home. But rather than backing down, she went back to work the next day, picked up the phone, and said, "Kia ora." Now, this news of her almost dismissal travelled around the country and hit headlines. And when David read them, he was outraged. Fired for saying kia ora? How ridiculous. And so for almost a month, David would organise his friends to call the post office over and over and over again, asking to speak with the kia ora lady. He also started greeting his passengers who would board his plane with the term kia ora and encourage other pilots to do the same. Now, this might seem like a series of quite small actions in the big scheme of things, But what history tells us is that this coordinated effort, plus the actions of Maori activists over decades and decades, created the political conditions so that in 1987, the year before I was born, Maori became an official language of New Zealand once again. A language I think it's important to remember was almost taken away forever in a country where it was once legal to beat children in schools who spoke it. This is Jane. I'm going to ask you to fast forward a little bit, imagining now we're in 2017. Jane is a lawyer. She's the first in her family to have graduated from university. She's from an iwi in Whanganui who have been petitioning the court to have their rights over their land and their river recognised for more than 150 years. That's what inspired Jane to go to law school in the first place. Jane's iwi have a whakatoki, or a proverb, that when translated says, "The great river flows from the mountains to the sea. I am the river, and the river is me." Which I think to a lot of us sounds like a lovely piece of poetry, a romantic notion. But for Jane and her iwi, this is a statement of reality. Because in the Maori worldview, the rivers, the lakes, the trees, they are our ancestors. All of us came from Papa Tuanuku, our Earth Mother, and all of us have a sacred duty to protect her. A duty that has been harder to achieve since colonisation started in New Zealand. Since 1840, over 90% of Maori land has been forcefully taken or questionably acquired by the Crown and by settlers. And I know a lot of people think that Maori land activism is about regaining those property rights. But the truth is, there is no direct translation for the word ownership in the language of Maori. A lot of Maori land activism is actually about protecting our mother, protecting nature. Jane's iwi were worried about the health and well-being of the Whanganui River because of industrialisation, deforestation, and sewage. But what's incredible about Jane's story is that after 150 years, last year, Whanganui became the first river in the world to be granted legal personhood. And legal personhood basically means that if someone or a company were to bring harm upon the Whanganui River, that person or that company can be held accountable for those actions in the same way as if you bring harm upon a person. To Māori, though, and to me, that is just a legal recognition of something we have always known, which is that rivers are our ancestors and rivers are living beings. And the reason I've shared these stories with you today and asked you to travel back in time is because, like Jane and like Naida, I am Māori. And like Sarah, I am in a relationship with a woman. And on almost all fronts, my life today is better than the parallel me of 30 or 60 years ago, but it wouldn't have been if it wasn't for people like them standing up for what's right. It wouldn't have been if it wasn't for activism. Today, I sadly still cannot speak Te Reo Māori fluently, but when I find the time to learn, I can sign up to a free course at my local university funded by the government. There are now 450 kohanga reo, or Māori language nests, or Māori language kindergartens, all around the country, all of them started by everyday aunties and nannies who just wanted to save the language for their children and their grandchildren. In fact, Te Reo Māori Today is so popular that it is selling out as fast as an Ed Sheeran or an Adele concert, according to this headline. Today, not only is it not illegal for me to be gay, but it's legal for me and my girlfriend to get married. Politicians don't tell us to go back to the sewer anymore. They join us at Pride, as you can see here, Mayor of Wellington Justin Lester and Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. Whanganui isn't the only natural feature that has gained legal personhood. So has Te Erewera Forest, and so has my ancestral mountain, Taranaki. All of that because of Māori land activism. And I think it's important when we're looking at the last 50 years of progress to think about what we can achieve over the next 50 years by working together. Over the last 4 years, I've had the enormous privilege and responsibility of working at Action Station. We're a community campaigning group that's non-partisan but not apolitical. We organise around the issues we care about and the values we share rather than political parties. Or in emoji terms, because I am a millennial after all, we organise awesome people in groups using digital tools to combine our skills, our money, our ideas, our time, our energy, our creativity, and our voice to create a fair and flourishing future for all of us. I'm going to share with you today the campaign that I am most proud of that we've been involved in over the last couple of years, which is about mental health. And this is important because in New Zealand we have one of the highest rates of youth suicide in the world. In 2016, mental health funding to Canterbury was going to be cut by then Health Minister Jonathan Coleman. He cited a lack of demand for services as the reason for this. But we knew that that wasn't true because we knew from people we've spoken to that there absolutely was still a demand for services, not just in Canterbury, but in our entire country. And we launched a petition. Within 5 days, we had 10,000 people who had signed that petition because of the internet. And that was 10,000 people that we could then coordinate and organize to try and drive the sorts of change we want. Our theory was that if we could keep this issue in the headlines beyond the initial outrage, we would be able to put pressure on the minister to change his mind. Because it was an election year coming up, and politicians who want to win votes need to be seen to respond positively to public opinion. And so we put a call out to the people who signed our petition, and we asked, do any of you have a story that you would be willing to share? We worked with Jane, who told the story of her son, who was quite young when the earthquakes hit, and he witnessed a man die. We turned that story into a social media video that quickly got 20,000 views within 1 week of us releasing it. And within 1 month of that original announcement of funding being cut to Canterbury, the health minister changed his mind, did not cut the funding, and instead put an extra $20 million. That was the time that we realized the power of people's personal stories to drive social change. The next year, we were speaking to people about what else needed to change in the mental health system, and over again, people told us we need an independent inquiry so we can find out what is working, what isn't working, what do we need to fix. The government at the time had been refusing to do one for quite a long time, and so we decided we should launch our own. We put out an open call for stories. We expected maybe 50 or 100 stories. We got 500. We read every single one of those stories, we pulled out the themes, we paired it with conversations with people who work in the mental health sector, people with lived experience. We made 5 recommendations, put it in a report, and delivered it to the government in just before their budget in 2017. But rather than welcoming our report and our recommendations with an open mind and an open heart, the health minister dismissed us as anti-government left-wing protesters. And I want us to really think about that for a second, because essentially, we were a group of everyday people coming together to make our voices heard on an issue that we had personal experience of, and we were dismissed as anti-government. But that is not anti-government. That is how good democracies work. Activism is democracy at work. To show that this wasn't just a left-wing issue, we did work with the unions to release independent polling that showed that 9 out of 10 New Zealanders felt that more needed to be done in mental health by our government. Mental health that year became an issue that was of great importance to voters, and the political parties who adopted our recommendations were the ones who took power. I'm happy to say that the government has just finished doing a mental health, the independent inquiry that we were all asking for. And they've also started a pilot project of free counselling for 18 to 25-year-olds, which I think will save lives. That year, though, something else happened. Our community decided that we wanted to come together, not just to resist the things that we don't want anymore, but to reimagine the things that we do want. So we gathered in community halls and lounges and pubs. One group even gathered in a McDonald's in Gisborne to discuss the future of the country in 2040, 200 years since the Treaty of Waitangi was signed. We very specifically chose a long-term date because we wanted imaginative thinking. But rather than just share with you our crowdsourced vision for the future, I'm going to ask you to imagine that it's 30 years in the future, so 2048. This is Aroha. Aroha was born on October 6, 2018, which for those of you who are paying attention is today. Aroha has seen enormous changes over her lifetime. Just last week, New Zealand closed its last prison and turned it into a wellness centre and free university. Almost all of our rivers in New Zealand are swimmable once again because the government and Maori agreed that we should give them all legal personhood. A lot of jobs have been automated, but thankfully we have a generous and unconditional support system that means that every single person in this country can live their life with dignity and participate fully in their community. The reason we were able to afford to do this is because in 2019, government, business and iwi came together to make a significant investment in the well-being of all New Zealanders. They realised that if people are culturally, socially, spiritually, physically and mentally well, they produce better business ideas, better productivity, better economic outcomes. And because of the unconditional social safety net that they instituted, it meant that people could take more entrepreneurial risks. People could foster their creativity and nurture their artistic abilities, and we have more world-class filmmakers, musicians and actors than ever. Now, this might all sound impossible in 30 years, but I invite you to consider the fact that legal personhood of rivers sounded impossible 30 years ago too, as did marriage equality, as did 450 kohanga reo all around the country. As people, we tend to overestimate what we can achieve in a year and underestimate what we can achieve in a lifetime. And I believe that if we come together to imagine a better future and then act with unity to make that happen, not just over 1 year, but over a generation, we can create the more fair, more just, more beautiful future that our hearts, our history, and our ancestors tell us is possible. Because what Sarah's story tells us, what Nida's story tells us, what David's story tells us, what Jane's story tells us, what the Action Station story tells us, is that everyday people can, do, and must change the world. The question is, what will your story be? What change will you make? Ngā mihi nui kia koutou, thank you very much.